Three, two, one. Boom, we're live. So, welcome back to another episode today. Really excited to be bringing you Walt Mayo from the Chief Executive Officer at Expert AI. Walt, how are you doing today, sir?
Fantastic. Friday morning. I'm broadcasting from the East Coast of the United States. So we're going into the Labor Day weekend. So I've got that to look forward to.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really excited for this. It's going to be a very good conversation. And there's a lot that I've speaking to the team and areas of expertise that you've got, Walt. Really want to dive into it. But maybe looking back and making sure that we set the scene for people that are joining us either live or on the recording. Maybe you can give us a bit of a detail to what your story is, Walt. Who are you and what's your kind of experience been to where you are at Expert AI? Because I always love to know, Walt, is it by chance that you fall into these tech spaces and these positions, or has it always been a passion? Tell us your story if you can.
So how long is the podcast? We've got 20 minutes, right?
We can go for as long as you like.
So, um, yeah, a bit, I would say probably a bit unconventional in the sense that I did have a fairly well-formed early career that was completely outside of technology.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was after graduating from university. And I'm not going to date myself, but I will give you a broad range. I graduated from university in the 1980s. Okay. And it was at that point really that technology was just beginning to emerge as a really transformative dynamic in the way people live, work, play, communicate.
Yeah.
But it was early days. And I started my career as a boy diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. I was a Foreign Service officer, and
Yeah.
so I was kind of traveling all around the world in U.S. embassies and diplomatic facilities. Now that common thread, though, did subsequently serve me well, in that much of my technology career has focused on working internationally and working across cultures and across borders. And that's actually relevant to expert.ai, which was founded in Modena, Italy. And we still have the bulk of our team in Italy. All of our engineers
Yeah.
are there, our computational linguists, our knowledge engineers, et cetera. But I was in the Foreign Service until my mid 30s. And I made a very conscious decision. And in that regard, getting into technology was a deliberate choice. And essentially, I was looking out, this would have been in the mid 90s. And
Yeah.
I was saying, what is the most important dynamic that is going to occur in terms of the way people live, work, communicate, the really kind of tectonic shift that was occurring? And this is
Yeah.
also concurrent with the fall of the former Soviet Union, the rise of free markets in China, et cetera, right? So there's this massive change taking place,
Yeah.
and technology seemed to be right dead center. Now, I really had no idea other than that was going to be important. Okay. So I very deliberately targeted my transition out of that foreign service diplomatic world
Yeah.
into technology. I worked my first summer. I went to business school and I worked my first summer, and it was a proof point for a company called Cray Supercomputer. Okay.
Okay. That's
And if
cool.
any of you want to go dig back in the history books, Cray Supercomputer
Make a
it
note of it.
was the deal back then, right? It I think has less computing power than the current generation of Apple iPhone, but at the time it was
Top
about
dog.
as far out there on technology as you could get. And that was to prove to myself that I could equip myself reasonably well in a deep technology field. And then from there, I ended up going to work for Dell, and that's really what carried me through into my technology career.
Yeah, that's awesome. Because it's such, like you said, it's such an exciting now. It's such an exciting time for me and for people that are involved in this area, especially with areas that you're involved with, NLP and NLU, and all these areas that are really exploding, especially with voice technology, more things being done through that, and more smart sensors than ever before. It's just baffles me to think like how how quickly we're progressing. Like you look at certain industries or certain areas just 10 years ago, Walt, that massive change, right? Like how it's just exploding so quickly.
Oh yeah, 10 years. And again,
Five
you
years.
go back 2012, right? That was really the very beginning. And I think that it was right. I think it was 2012
Mm,
when the first real breakthrough in this current evolution of what is broadly entitled artificial intelligence occurred,
Yeah.
and that was with a deep learning approach, and it was called AlexNet, and it was an object recognition approach, right?
Okay.
And all of a sudden, people said, "Wow, we're really on to something." But
Yeah.
even you go back to 2012, and what people were talking about then was this concept of the cloud, right? And somehow putting your workload and infrastructure in the cloud,
Yeah.
right? So it has been staggering. I think one of the things though um, is it's been very uneven, right? So
Yeah.
we think about the way in which it's changed how people communicate and how they interact, and the smartphone would probably be the biggest example of that, right? But then if you say, well, what are the other really, really big occurrences that have emerged as a result of technology that have fundamentally changed important parts of the human dynamic? And
Yeah.
the answer's less obvious,
Yeah.
right? So you think about, for example, what happened with this global pandemic, which was a clear call to arms for technology
Yeah.
in 2020,
Step
right?
up. Yeah.
AI was remarkably absent from that entire effort, right?
Yeah.
Um, but what we saw were pharmaceutical companies that were able to marshal their resources, potentially collaborate more effectively, and produce a vaccine at speeds that had never before been considered, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of Peter Thiel. He's not one of my favorite people, but he said, we thought we'd have flying cars, instead we got 140 characters, right? So I think there's that dynamic in AI as well, which is the potential is there, but we're still kind of struggling through
Yeah.
how, in practical terms, can it really change the way for the better um, businesses save money, protect their reputations, reduce risk, get things done faster, reduce drudgery in their work, et cetera. And
Yeah.
that's really what we focus on. It's practical AI.
Yeah, I love that, and it's such a good point as well because I was literally. It reminds me of like the 2001 Space Odyssey film, and obviously I was very young when that first came out. I don't even think I was born when it first came out, but looking at it from what it said that's going to be by 2001 and what it's going to be. And I also saw Mark Andreessen recently in an interview. He was like talking about the computers back in like 1965 or 1970. And he actually, when listening to that, I went to go listen to Steve Jobs' Apple iPhone reveal in 2007, June 2007. And that's what, nearly just over 15 years ago. Yeah, look at all these transformations like you're mentioning, Walt, like what's driving it now and what's really transforming it. And I see it as the big thing that drove cloud, for example, is when Satya Nadella changed everything in Microsoft, I think around 2013, and was just like, we're going to do a massive push between moving infrastructure to the cloud. And that arguably was a game changer for all sorts of industries. But there's a lot of things that are changing at the moment that I think I'd love to delve into and get your feedback on, Walt, because your team very kindly highlighted a stat around IDC and looking at unstructured data and saying by more than 50% every year, and by 2025, it will form as much as 80% of data will be unstructured. And I actually looked at it on VentureBeat as well, and they've come up with the same stat saying 80% of global data sphere will be unstructured by 2025. As
Yeah,
someone
I
that's
mean that.
yeah, go on. I would love to hear your feedback and your kind of view on this
Sure,
one.
I think that's just an observation around the amount of data creation that's occurring, right?
Yeah,
And just as a point of reference, when we talk about structured versus unstructured data, essentially the distinction that we're making is with structured data, it's discrete and immutable. It only has one meaning, right? So a number is a number, and it represents only a single value. And you can perform mathematical operations on it. So, the kinds of data that's provided in financial reporting, some sensor data that is discretely rendered, right? So it's a measurement of something.
yeah,
Unstructured data is where you have a complex form of data,
got you.
and the data form can be ambiguous, and it's difficult to perform mathematical operations on it, right?
Yeah,
So think about pictures, for example, right? You can't really multiply pictures. I mean, um, it represents a data form, and if you think about and this is one of the, I think, unanticipated consequences of technology is I don't think anyone would have said in 2000, with the explosion of internet, with the explosion of processing power and of cheap storage, two huge dynamics will be people will take massively more pictures than they ever took before,
Yeah.
right? So they'll be taking pictures all the time, which of
Yeah.
course everyone's doing, right? And they'll create more language that will be more accessible to more people than ever before. They're going to write way more than they ever did, and people are going to read more than they ever did before, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that was kind of like, wait a minute, is that really what's going to be? But that's the core of the unstructured data, right? Now,
Yeah.
the critical thing about that is in a business context, unstructured data can be important,
Yeah.
right? And where we focus in expert.ai is this particularly complex but ubiquitous form of data, which is the primary way that humans receive and impart information, and that's language.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's a very dense form of data, and the amount of language that powers and surrounds the enterprise has exploded. Right?
Yeah.
So that dynamic where you're going to have massive amounts of data that isn't typically the data that technology has evolved to address up to this point. And
Yeah.
we see that as well with things like, object recognition for full self-driving cars. Elon Musk, it's always been a year away, right? And he's been saying that every year for a while now. So
Yeah.
um, it does pretty clearly point to the challenge around how does the enterprise take this unstructured data and try to drive value out of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's a great overview as well of looking at it from an unstructured data point of view and a structured point of view. And I'd love to know what have you seen, Walt, or is there any area that you can, if you were looking at it from a top level view, how can companies do things with their unstructured data? Because they might be collecting it, like you said. There's a lot of value to unlock there. Is there any like best practice or things you've seen, or areas or considerations for, or ideas of what they can get out of it for? As you mentioned a few there, but to really drive value from unstructured data.
Yeah, I think it doesn't take a lot of reflection for any enterprise to look at the language data flows that are important in their business,
Yeah,
right? So if you were to just take a step back and the way we would guide a business to do that is at a couple levels, right?
yeah,
Um, One is what are important workflows
yeah,
that you are doing right now that are language dense?
yes,
And it typically starts with something pretty straightforward like customers trying to communicate with you. And the way they do that is by generally writing something to you in whatever form,
yeah,
right? Now, somebody has to read that. And the two key things that I would put forward as kind of foundational for any enterprise is start to look at language as data.
yeah,
Just take that as a given, all right, and say this is a data stream that is in my enterprise. Okay.
yeah,
Then secondly, think about it and say, okay, it is tractable with some of the approaches that have emerged broadly under this category of artificial intelligence, natural language processing, natural language understanding. Right? So
yeah,
you can actually begin to address that data flow.
yeah,
And then look at major workflows where lots of people are engaged in reading and understanding language. That would be one. Okay. Another one would be um, when you have complex language where accuracy is important because mistakes are costly,
yeah,
right? So typically, who's going to have to handle that language? Well, an expert
yeah,
for obvious reasons, right? You don't want to make mistakes. It tends to be very domain dense,
yeah,
right? So think about those elements where you say there's complex language. It tends to be fairly dense. We don't want to make mistakes. Who's handling that language, right?
yeah,
So we call that, that those buckets kind of analyze and understand. And then the final thing, a lot of companies have begun to adopt robotic process automation, digital workers to accelerate some form of process. right?
Yeah.
Where you're moving information from point to point that's going through a workflow. Think about injecting an intelligent element in that process
Mm.
that takes it from robotic process automation to intelligent process automation.
Yeah.
And if it's a language workflow, the intelligent element that you are introducing is language understanding.
Mm.
So say, there's a process, it's important, a fair number of people are doing it, it has a material business result, and they're reading language data.
Yeah.
That is an opportunity that is a reasonable grounds for investigating whether AI, NLU, NLP could add some value.
Yeah. I love that. And do you think there's a challenge, or do you think there's a reason, not a challenge, do you think there's a reason why certain data teams, maybe in more of a legacy driven business, or maybe an SME that's really coming to light at the moment, that, or maybe just an industry, why data teams aren't really addressing the challenges of unstructured data? Or do you think it's a training
Oh
issue? Or
no,
do you think there's something
I
else?
definitely have a strong point of view on
Yeah.
that. Um, so a couple of reasons. One, it's super hard.
Yeah.
It's just a very, very complex computational challenge.
Yeah.
Okay. Two, the current generation of data scientists have largely emerged in the last 5 years, trained on a structured data set of approaches broadly under the rubric of machine learning and deep learning.
Right.
So they're coming at it with a structured data mindset, right? And one of the key things that we put forward with expert.ai is that machine learning and deep learning, while they do offer some benefits with NLP,
Mm.
by themselves, they're insufficient to deliver really meaningful value,
Yeah.
right? So you have a lot of and that might be a little bit of an overstatement. There are some generalized use cases where machine learning approaches can add value, right? But even then it's hard,
Yeah.
right? And to be clear, right, take a step back.
Yeah.
Even for the structured data problems, right, the track record of homegrown AI projects that clearly delivered ROI
Mm.
is a bit underwhelming because,
Yeah.
again, it's hard, right? So I think that those are two elements that definitely have driven the fact that most enterprises have not really yet taken on this opportunity to
Yeah.
analyze, understand, and accelerate their language data.
Yeah. It's quite important though, right? Because you see the amount of people, no, it's really important to me because you see more and more voice being used across different businesses. Like I always say, and it's a really simple way of looking at it, Walt. People never used to send voice notes. Now I communicate with some of my friends mostly through voice notes and business documents. If you're looking at important documents that need to go through banks or certain emails to capture email threads, it kind of baffles me that some companies aren't making this leap or seeing it as important as it needs to be. I struggle to see why.
Well, we're seeing, you know, in the conversational AI arena, we're clearly seeing real advances, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
you think about Alexa and Siri and some of the AI conversational capabilities that provide a first level of a response. Again, they're not too far from what we used to get with the standard IVR. And for the most part, when you call up, you're still kind of getting a push one
Yeah.
if you would like to speak
What
to,
if you're
push two,
yeah.
right? And it's not the kind of thing like, hey, I need to have my tennis racket restrung. How long is it going to take? Right.
Yeah.
So I called a sporting goods store yesterday. I wanted to find out, okay, I still got a couple weeks of tennis left for the summer, and I'm not sure I want to take my racket in.
Yeah.
No, I had to get to a person, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, I think it's out there. Um, you know, what we represent is the real choice for the enterprise, and this would be a strong recommendation, right? Is don't build your own capabilities to try to build these complex technologies.
Yeah.
And this is not self-serving, to be clear, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got 100 NLP engineers, world
Yeah.
class, and it's still hard. Okay,
Yeah.
we have 120 computational linguists.
Yeah.
These people are rocket scientists, right? And it's
Yeah.
still hard. right?
Yeah.
There's very few companies that are going to hire that many folks, right?
Yeah.
So what I would say is build your capability to evaluate and be thoughtful around
Yeah.
how you can apply the technology.
Yeah. Well, I always think that's a great point, Well, because I look at it and I always think if I can outsource something to the pros that's spending day in, day out in that field, it's like that's who I'm going to go to. And if they're the one, like, why would I try and get into something that's not my field if they're the ones that can unlock my ultimate outcome quicker? Like, I don't know. Maybe I just look at it very simple.
No,
But
I mean, but it's a pretty common cycle that occurs with technology adoption, right? So the early adopters typically are looking to create the capability to have the technology as a competitive advantage. So they're going to
right.
do it better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
Um, and particularly because a lot of technologies emerge, and this is very true of the recent iteration of machine learning and deep learning, NLP approaches as
Yeah.
open source capabilities. So the
Yeah.
idea is, well, look, it's free. Let's just hire some data scientists. We can put this together, and we'll have a capability that will be a strategic asset. I mean, if you're a hotel chain or you're an airline, it's probably unlikely that you're going to have a strategic advantage through your superior use of language, artificial intelligence approaches for obvious reasons. That's not
Yeah.
where you're going to make most of your money.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're not the pro in the field. That's a really good point. And maybe talk us through then. What's the whole? So before I go into it, I know that you've got some critiques on it, Walt, but GPT-3. Maybe explain to people that aren't too familiar with it what that whole idea is. And you were mentioning then being open source and machine learning approaches to AI. Maybe give us a bit of background to what GPT-3 is and how you see it helping businesses and how you what maybe your critiques are of it.
All right. Well, my section around how it's going to help businesses will be considerably shorter. As a matter of fact, I'm now done.
Yeah, there you
Okay.
go.
Now, look, you have to think about this, and the evolution of it is really the the foundation of almost all of these approaches to large to language understanding, language processing, is a technology broadly in deep learning. Okay, and deep learning, they're very, very complex networks of um, mathematical operations. So layers
Yeah,
upon layers of mathematical operations, right? Um, and they're extraordinarily powerful. But there's a couple things about them. One is they're super data hungry.
yeah,
So they require massive amounts of data. Okay. They're also compute intensive. So they have to run on GPUs. So they're
yeah,
costly, right?
yeah.
Costly to train,
Hardware.
costly to run, which also has a carbon footprint impact that is non-trivial. Um,
Yeah,
they're also so complex that they are, in many important elements, not well understood.
mm,
So the behaviors and dynamics that deep learning um, can exhibit, in many cases, they're recognized and observed,
yeah,
but they're not very clearly known, which means that you can get some pretty unusual outcomes. Like one, probably my favorite one in deep learning is called catastrophic forgetfulness. And I just
right.
love that term, right?
It's a good
Um,
time.
and what that means basically is that deep learning can recognize patterns in massive data sets. And again, it's just doing correlation, not causation. So it's saying this and this tend to go together. So I'm going to start to make some outcomes that are predicated on that, right?
Right.
But as you introduce more data, the things that the deep learning patterns that had been recognized before, you can actually lose them,
Yeah,
right? So it's prone to this kind of element of forgetfulness. All right.
yeah,
So out of that, there's almost the logical absurd of the approach is you've had the very, very deep pocketed, well-funded research organizations, typically that are associated with Meta, Microsoft, which is OpenAI, Google. They took an approach to language understanding where they created models that were massively larger, right?
yeah,
So 175 billion parameters in GPT-3. Okay.
Yeah.
So 175 billion parameters. Think of them as basically points of mathematical consequence.
Right.
And maybe that's not the most elegant way of describing it, but
Yeah.
suffice it to say, there's a lot going on. Okay.
Yeah. A lot of different
Um,
options, a lot of different
yeah.
angles.
And it trained those language models basically on Common Crawl, which is the
Yeah.
entire content of the internet. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and they're primarily focused on what's called natural language generation, which is essentially text completion, but taken
Yeah.
to the nth degree, right? So it can put together GPT-3 and others, right? Cogent sounding, reasonably well structured, grammatically and syntactically correct language off of a prompt like Tom Allen and Walt Mayo were talking about AI on September 2nd, and Walt said, and then it can fill out a fair amount of prose that it's kind of making up, trying
Yeah.
to put something forward that sounds reasonably well structured. Okay.
Yeah.
The challenge there is it's basically what's called a stochastic parrot. Okay. And the
Yeah.
stochastic parrot means it's random
Yeah.
and it's just repeating snippets of language that sound vaguely right. Okay.
So it's just picking up a piece of word, spitting it out, and kind of it catches on, and it might be slightly correct in context, but it's got no real value.
Exactly. And the challenge with that is it sounds right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I wrote a blog post about somebody asked GPT-3, what is the number before 1 million? And GPT-3 said 900,099,
Yeah.
which sounds kind of right, but it's not. It's 999,999. And there have been other, examples of that. And so you think about it and you say, okay, boy, that's kind of concerning because it sounds authoritative. It sounds like it's well structured. This is not Google putting 10 things out for you to choose from. It's providing a prose answer, right? And
Yeah.
then there was a piece on, gosh, it was on Wednesday in the MIT Technology Review,
Yeah.
where one of their writers said, I wonder what GPT-3 knows about me. Because again,
Yeah.
it's pulling stuff from the internet, and did the same thing for her editor. And it came up with phone numbers and personal information.
Yeah.
And then it also said some things that were completely wrong. So there's this kind of mash of half right,
Yeah.
and then privacy issues. And then, fundamentally, the other thing is they're massively expensive. So as of now, although there are some movements towards open source, they're really only under the control of the very wealthiest and deep-pocketed technology companies, right?
Yeah.
Final point on that, right? It's not super clear exactly what they do that's of use to much of anybody, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of these things where people are doing it and then they're saying the answer will come out later, as
Just
to
hoping,
how
basically.
we're going to use it.
Yeah. Just hoping that if they get enough sequences out of it or enough results, they'll be able to use it in one way or another and class
No,
it
I'm
as a.
sure there will be some use cases that emerge, but I mean, like Meta put out BlenderBot in beta just like 2 weeks ago based on these models, and they put right up there, warning, much of what this says is offensive or untrue. And you're
Yeah.
kind of like, nah, why are you putting it out? But there you go.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because if you look at like the generic description of it, it just says learning to produce human-like text as part of it. There's nowhere saying it actually can give value, and that's just typing it into Google. It's an interesting point, because it's like, well, what's the point in doing it if you can't have that? And I think with voice as well, correct me if I'm wrong, Walt, but my point of view is with voice, it's all about context and all about what it's being used for and all about the positioning, because one's
Of course.
like how you say something, it can mean completely something else, or how you come across saying it, right?
Well, so the take away the complexity of tone and inflection in voice, right? So if you raise your tone at the end of a sentence, you're posing a question, right? And
Yeah.
that's a computational challenge, but it has more to do with audio than with language understanding. Okay, but the there's a there's a very prominent early linguist named J.R. Firth, and he said, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps."
Yeah.
And what they mean by that is, if you think about words, take a common English word like bank, right? Now, a bank can be a financial institution. Fantastic. So if you're talking about, I'm going to take out a loan, so I need to go to the bank.
Yeah.
People know what you're referring to. You say, I can't wait to see the Henley Regatta. I've got a great seat right on the bank of the river.
Yeah.
People will know what you're talking about, right? Same word, two different contexts, right? Predicting that mathematically is pretty hard. And if you think about it, there's obvious reasons why. If each word has many different contexts and you're trying to use the words to predict the meaning of the other words, the computational challenge gets quite high. The approach that we've taken, and that was the original approach to the language, was what's called a symbolic approach, which is to try to embed understanding of language in the way that humans do, right?
Yeah.
So we don't do mathematical predictions, right? We have context and meaning.
Yeah.
And so we're able to associate the meaning by virtue of our understanding of the language.
Yeah, that's really important. I feel like you've just given a massive tip to any company listening on what they might need to consider. Would you have any recommendations following what you've just said, Walt, to companies that are maybe, or advice to or industries, maybe not just companies, overcoming these kind of, because it seems like it's overhyped as well, right? From what I'm reading, would you say it's overhyped?
Oh, no, I mean, I've had this conversation with the team. We're
Yeah.
coming out with a framework on responsible AI, right?
Yeah.
And that's one I want to start with, Tom, right? So responsible AI is any business that is considering adopting technology should be very thoughtful about the way in which the technology is providing the benefit. Okay.
Okay.
And that means, in the same way that you would evaluate any other technology, you should look at the entire element, or any other purchase. You should
Yeah.
look at the entire consequences of adopting it. So is it super energy intensive?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you have a commitment to reducing your carbon footprint, think twice if you're choosing the most energy intensive approach to anything, right?
Yeah.
Um, in the world of AI, because it's so fundamentally tied to human decision making, you should be very, very thoughtful about the way in which the technology is helping guide or accelerate or improve your decision making, particularly when it gets into the arena of choices that have consequences for people, whether it's HR, right? You're hiring somebody, right?
Yeah.
A work process where you're evaluating somebody. It could be medical claims for an insurance company. It could be home loans for a bank, right?
Yeah.
So start there. So start off in saying, we're going to go into this technology because it's so critically important to human decision making in a very thoughtful way, and assess the total approach that the technology offers. So that would be point one. Okay.
Okay.
With a degree of humility. And look, in the technology world, we're not super well known for our humility. We tend to, come out and say, we're changing the world, and, adopt our software, and your teeth will be whiter and your breath will be fresher and every day will be perfect, right?
Yeah.
But go in with pretty real, clear-eyed, right? So that would be point one. To do your homework, and that is understand the basic capabilities of NLP and NLU.
Yeah.
So what is kind of the range of what's out there
Yeah.
in a reasonable way? So 100% language understanding accuracy is not attainable
Yeah.
in a meaningful way. Well, guess what? You don't have it with human beings.
Yeah.
So why do you think you're going to get it with artificial intelligence, right? And doing your homework, also take a look at others who might have done something similar, right? And then the next thing is look for language data flows that are material to your business.
Yeah.
They're complex and important. There's a lot of them. You have a lot of people working on them. They're tied to things like customer experience or payments or what have you, right? And once you have that, bring all the stakeholders to the table. Do not consider it a technology problem. It's a business opportunity. And in a language environment, in almost every instance, you're going to have human beings who do work differently,
Yeah.
right? So bring your stakeholders to the table. And then
Yeah.
the final thing, you need to be able to put a number on the benefit. So,
To measure it.
you see a fair number of people who say, I think there's this dynamic where the CEO comes in and says, AI, that's going to be huge. We've got to get AI. And
Yeah.
then, the CTO goes, well, okay, but, in order to do that, I'm going to have to hire a bunch of data scientists. Well, you go hire data scientists. Okay. And then, not solve business problems. Know how much money you'll save or make, right? Know how much risk you'll reduce.
Yeah.
So
That's
those
great.
would be the 4 things, right? Take a responsible approach, understand the fundamental capabilities, do your homework, look for material language data flows, and then set clear measures of success.
Yeah.
And
Some
then give
really
us a call. And then call expert.ai.
I love it. Well, there's some great points as well. Because I always say a
That's
book that
5.
there
Yeah,
you go. The final fifth one. I'll add that in for
that's right.
cool AI. Contact them. But it's a really good point that you make because I always recommend to people is Creativity Inc. And it's all about how Pixar was formed and arguably bring up some of the best animation studios, best films. And they say it is by having that diverse thing and having that thinking. And I see it a lot at the moment with RPA in particular, Walt. And this is a personal view from what I've seen, who I speak to at conferences, that companies don't need it. Like it's if you're not at the right stage or certain processes don't need to be automated through digital workflows. And it just thinks like similar to what you were saying, know your business outcome, know what you want to do, know your agenda for why you're bringing it in, because it might not be the right time, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest solution suffices, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that should inform any approach to any business decision,
Yeah. But
where
people
you
miss it on
say,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
what's the easiest way to get something important done,
Yeah.
right? And AI,
Great point.
I mean, again, here's the other thing. Look at it as software. Just say it's software. Hold it to that standard. And look, software gets a big buy anyways,
Yeah.
right? Because if we had refrigerators that were as buggy as a lot of software, everybody would be really upset, right?
Yeah.
You plug your refrigerator in, come back in 20 years, and you're still getting cold food,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, um, there are important language data flows in most enterprises that they're doing right now
Yeah.
that are tractable with thoughtful approaches to AI.
Yeah.
I would say in general, though, another one, and this is a point of view, and people can argue with me on this, right?
Mm.
Don't believe that machine learning, deep learning alone is going to get you where you need to be.
Yeah.
And
That's what
consider the total cost, because a
yeah.
lot of times I had a conversation one time with a chief data officer, and she was talking about a project that she had done, and I said, well, how long did it take? And she said 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's incredible. Like I've never heard of a project that has only taken 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And she said, well, no, we did a year of advanced work, but then actually getting it done took 2 weeks. And it's
Always
kind of like,
understand.
okay, that
So
took a
you're
year.
silly.
Let's be clear, right?
It's a year or 2 weeks.
All
It's
right.
not just 2
Like,
weeks.
so how many people were working on that,
Day and day.
mostly full time, times
Yeah.
their salary?
Yeah.
Okay, that's how much it cost you.
Yeah.
Right. And now, how long is it going to take? How many people will it take to maintain? And how much does it cost to operate and all the other things? Right.
Yeah.
So,
That's it's a great way of looking at it all. Because the point I think I've worded it slightly wrong, but the point I was getting to is not that you don't need it, but the amount of companies I speak to and they're like, oh, people just want to deploy RPA or AI in particular. And it's just like, well, what's your outcome? And they're just like, we don't know. It's the cool, trendy thing to buy. And it's just like, great, but I'm sure we can use it somewhere. But it's like, we need to know like what you actually want to do. Like, is it increase revenue? Is it increase efficiency? Whatever it might be. Like it can get
sure.
very technical. But people seem
Yeah.
to
I
miss
mean, and, to be clear, and it's still early days, right? So there's
it.
we did the survey and people recognize there's an opportunity there, but most businesses are being fairly thoughtful about it. But there is fear of missing out. So a lot of businesses are kind of like, we have to investigate and we have to invest, even if we're not certain of the outcome. Well, okay, that happens, right? I get it. Um, the the idea of kind of going all in without having a clear understanding of the outcome, that does not make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, I don't think it's super hard to take a look at the workflows and the way people gather language information and make decisions to see opportunities where you say, look, this is hard. We can probably do it in a better way to make faster, better, more consistent decisions. Let's investigate technologies that might help us, whether it's
Yeah.
RPA or RPA plus NLU to get IPA, which we're
Mm.
quite bullish on, right? But I think you have to kind of take a step back. Um, one of our core verticals is insurance, and insurance is a domain that is super language dense,
Yeah.
policies, claims, etc. So, of course, there's going to be lots of opportunity there
Yeah.
to handle that language data more effectively.
Yeah. No, I love it. And I love that there's the introduction. Like I always think like where did the first chief data officer role come from, or where did the first data scientist role come from? And I discussed this with someone earlier, and they're like, it used to be data mining, and that's what they saw it as. And then all these new roles that are coming up, like you said, it's early days. I always wonder what roles are going to be around in 10 years, like at 2032, to handle what new opportunities come to see all this. But it's very interesting that you do a lot of research, Walt, as well with expert AI, because you found out that like more than 90% agreed that it's something that needs to be addressed, right? It's clearly people are seeing
For
more and more.
sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what's going to have to happen is, and I've been trying to figure out what that title is going to look like, right?
I don't know
And
what
I
one you're.
think it's something like data solutions architect,
Yeah.
right? And there, what you're talking about is your individuals who know business problems, the data elements that are material in the business problems. Because remember, in almost every instance, the data is feeding a decision,
Yeah.
okay? And then is saying how tractable are our unique problems, and then at what cost? Because that gives you the ROI,
Yeah.
right?
Allows you to measure it. Yeah.
So a data solutions architect is somebody who is conversant in the business and the domain, because business problems are domain, they tend to be domain specific, right?
Right.
If you think about what does a mining company have in common with a bank? Well, a lot of technology approaches right now have found the common elements, right? So they say, okay, your financial management system based on a standardized approach to financial reporting is broadly similar. Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough, right? But as you start to get into the language world, right, the domain relevance is like super important, right? It's a different language. I've heard any number of businesses say, well, we have our own language here at, you know, company X. And
Yeah.
they do, right?
Yeah. They're looking at it a different way. It's like what we were saying earlier, context. Like understanding the
Exactly.
context of what it is, which is really important.
Yep.
No, I think that's really important. That's a really good point as well. Because I always think what roles are going to be around. One of my favorite role is I said it on yesterday on a podcast we are doing is a solutions architect or a solutions engineer, because I find them like the perfect match between knowing the application, not doing actual the back work, but understand it from a top level view to think we know the perfect solution for your business, or a solutions, yeah, someone along those lines. I think that's
Data solutions architect. I think you're right.
yeah,
Now the others on the flip side, here's one I would be very careful about, right?
yeah, go on.
There's an exaggerated view at times, and it's the same thing around this rush. Let's go hire a bunch of data scientists, right? Sometimes it can create a whole cascading effect where you say, okay, we have data scientists, and now they're pushing towards, because of their area of expertise, they're pushing towards machine learning
Yeah.
approaches. And then you say, well, now we need machine learning engineers, right?
So you have like this digressive model where if you just
And
take
yeah,
that, yeah,
and to be clear, and with the large language models, I actually, my favorite one, just because it flat out I think is nuts,
yeah,
is a prompt engineer. So that is somebody who can phrase language prompts in a way that will reduce the likelihood of these large language models producing some kind of toxic gibberish. And
yeah,
you're thinking, really, is that a job? It just feels to me like you're, you know, you're doing something a little bit out there. And I wrote a blog post about it, and I called it title-driven outcomes, right? Because if you hire a machine learning engineer, they're going to work on machine learning engineering
Yeah, the
for sure,
speciality.
right? Now, whether that's going to be material to your business or not, not as clear, but you
Yeah.
can be sure they're going to be spending all of their time. And I called it, nail smacking, and it's from the old saw about if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. If you hire a machine learning engineer, and no slight to machine learning engineers, there's some very important work that they do, but be very
Yeah.
thoughtful as you bring these roles in. Maybe start with something closer to what you were describing, like this data solutions architect or solutions architect or
Yeah.
process architect or something like that.
Yeah. 'Cause this brings the whole idea around like what do you call it? Like I forgot the name, citizen developers and stuff, like bringing them through, and if they're the right answer, if they're not the right answer, what do you think? What is there? Do you think there's a place for them, or because you do get a bit diversified ideas, but then at the same time, they're not a machine learning, they're not the person that has the specialism. So again, it's just like, well, that's a catch. It's like someone said to me, they said hire a data engineer before you hire a data scientist. I was like, okay, that's their point of view, but it's
No, I agree there, right? And I think, look, everybody's got some accountability here, right? So,
yeah,
we talk about citizen data scientists. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Um, but if you say, I think it's reasonable, I'm a CEO of a company, right? And I think it's reasonable for me to say to everyone in the company, I want your decisions to be thoughtful and where defensible.
mm,
And that generally means there's some meaningful data elements that you can point to that drove your decision. We
yeah,
should do X, not because I feel like it or because it makes my life easier, but
yeah,
because I can see, based on the information I have,
yeah,
an outcome that's material to the business. Okay, so
yeah,
start there. And there's a lot of talk around data literacy. Well, yes, we need that. Okay, because
yeah,
there's more data that's available. And what you also have to have is an appreciation of what is the range of capability that's offered by current proven technology,
yeah,
right? So you're not going in for a bunch of nonsense and hype, and you can be thoughtful about that, right?
yeah,
And then committing to, in the same way that if somebody said, well, I don't want to change the way I work, you'd say, well, that's not really, you don't get to take that stance, right? I mean, the most successful companies are the ones where people are constantly thinking about how can we do things better,
yeah, change it
right?
and move
And
it.
typically that's happening at the employee level,
Yeah,
right? So they're the ones who are saying, look, if we do this and this, it would make it work better, right?
yeah.
And you need to arm them with the ability to access data to help inform those decisions.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a great point. How to move it forward. I really love that. It's a great point you made, one. I want to be respectfully timed, but I do have one more question I really want to ask. So you covered it earlier about the suggestions for starting, or to me, you kind of answered it with the first natural language project, what they need to consider, the 5 steps, which I think are 5 brilliant steps. 4 elaborated to 5, which I like. But what would you recommend? Well, if companies are coming or an industry, how would you look at it if they're trying to measure the ROI of their AI projects? Because that's something we haven't asked. We were kind of touching on the first point, but it's very important, as you said, measuring it, understanding it, business outcomes. Is there best practice? Is there something you'd recommend, or is there something you'd recommend for them to go look at so they can get the ROI on using someone like Expert AI or someone or whatever it might be, whatever project it is?
Yeah. So I have a very strong point of view on that. You should be able to do on a piece of paper with a calculator the ROI on any project, and it should be compelling,
Yeah,
period. Okay. And it should be roughly 2 to 3 times what the software costs you, and
yeah,
it should be fast, right? Um, Now, there is, I go to these conferences and they're generally data and analytics conferences because AI conferences are just kind of emerging.
yeah,
And there's an extraordinary amount of money that is still being spent on basic infrastructure, right? So if, again, the chief data officer comes to the CEO and says, look, we got a major initiative here. We want to create a data fabric.
yeah,
The CEO is going to go, what does that have to do with me? And what does that have to do with this business? And by the way, what is a data fabric? Oh,
yeah,
it's like a data mesh, but it's a unified layer of data. Uh, okay. How much? again, what does that have to do with the business? Now,
Yeah.
core infrastructure, that is still a challenge, right? But what I'm seeing is that some of the chief data officers, which is generally where our world operates, they're so focused in trying to create the grand unified underlying architecture that they're not actually taking on the and embracing the idea that, wait a minute, there's technology out there right now that I can bring to my business owners that will help them do their job faster and better.
Mm.
Okay. So there's
Yeah.
this dynamic where it's kind of falling in the middle. So you've got the business owners who aren't really in a position to evaluate the technology terribly well. And
Yeah.
then the data officers, in many cases, are kind of like, well, no, my job is really just putting together the grand plumbing, right?
Yeah.
And I would say for the data officers, you know enough about it, start taking these use cases out there. And it should be pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Can I do something a lot faster with better accuracy, more consistency? And can I understand my business and access knowledge about it more easily, right?
Yeah.
And it should be some math,
Yeah.
right? Simple math. Like if I do this, my software will cost $200,000 and I'm going to save $1 million.
Yeah. And that to me is a very it's a very good sound investment. It's a very good investment if you put it like that. And I think that's the first time. Well, I think first time. Maybe I'm incorrect, but I'm sure it is where it's not been some massive contingency plan or some massive plan of like this is how you properly measure it. I love that. It should be simple. If you can't measure it on a piece of
No,
paper,
I mean, look, somebody said, how much is your, they were asking me, how much does your software cost? And I said, well, one, we only solve meaningful problems, which means we're
yeah,
not cheap. Okay.
yeah,
And then two,
less,
basically, um, we should solve problems that cost you 3 times more than our software costs.
yeah,
Or you should be able to point to the money that you will make that's 3 times larger. And I say
yeah.
that way, if we don't quite get it right, you're still fine.
Yeah, it's still hitting out of the park. It's still a good way. Do you think there's anything that's going to change, like the whole like? There's a lot of talk, and I don't know if this is something we should go down, but with what you're doing at Expert AI or expert.ai and what you and the team are focused on with new areas coming up, like autonomous driving and the metaverse and new applications. I mean, it's largely unexplored. Do you think it's going to change much in the way we look at NLP and NLU, or how it's going to change?
No, I think one of the I'm relatively new to the domain,
Yeah,
and one of the things that has struck me is we're still very early days, even
yeah,
in
that's
core NLP,
yeah,
right? So, I mean, if you were to here's an example. You go to a company, let's say it's a decent sized company, and maybe there's 25,000 employees, right? And you say, I want to find somebody, and I'll make up a scenario. They're manufacturing, and you've got a product line, and you say, I want to find somebody who can repair the GB153
yeah.
and speak Spanish. Okay, that's it. That's the task because you've got one. It's in Mexico. It's broken. You got
Yeah,
to find a technician. All right, go. And then you go to HR, and HR is like, we probably have that information somewhere, and it's
yeah,
written because it'll say Walt Mayo speaks Spanish and is certified on the GB153.
yeah,
Okay. All right. Good luck.
yeah,
That's where language understanding, you can basically say, if I have a language understanding skills inventory capability where I've classified meaningful things like language skills or certification levels, right?
yeah,
And classification is one of the things that language understanding provides,
yeah,
classifying language and then extracting it, right? Basically, you would say, yeah, I'll read my entire database of resumes
yeah,
and skills profiles, and it'll take me 5 minutes.
yeah,
In the same way that if you say, what were the sales in the Mid-Atlantic last month, people can get back to you with an answer pretty quickly. That's a structured data problem, right? You should be able to do that with unstructured language. The metaverse, look, I hope to live my life without experiencing the metaverse in any meaningful way. So I'll leave that to Mark
Well,
Zuckerberg.
yeah. It's always
And
good to
full
get people.
self-driving, yeah. Look, I like lane assist and the beeps that go off when you're tailgating. I love those, right? I wish they would make them louder. If people were a little bit more courteous, it would really, really help. The big problem that's occurred over the last 2 years, which is a massive increase in automobile accident fatalities in the United States, right? So we're talking about full self-driving, and yet people's behavior is unfortunately
more
not
erratic.
doing much. Yeah.
That's a great point. It's a great consideration as well. So I always love thinking about it. It's just because you're an expert in one field doesn't mean you can't have an opinion on something else. But it's and see how it ties in, like you said earlier, like bringing the right ideas. But what really appreciate your time, sir. You've got some great points and the 5 steps as well, which are really brilliant. And everything we've covered today, I've learned a lot personally, which is what I always say. I say from a very selfish point of view, I get to learn from you, but the whole audience at AI Journal does as well. So really appreciate you coming on, Walt.
I appreciate your repeated references to the 5 steps.
Yeah.
In particular,
5, yeah.
Yeah, with the 5th being call expert.ai. So thanks for that.
No,
Tom, it was super fun. I enjoyed it. It was a great way to start off the day.
Yeah, I'm glad. Good way to start onto Friday and kick into the weekend. So,
why not?
I really appreciate it. And everyone else that's joined us, tune back for the next one. And whether you're watching on the recording or live, let us know what you think. And thanks for joining. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.